In the last chapter, we learned how to design with CSS, using images and understanding the basics. This time around, we'll learn how to best write CSS, how to review our code, and create links, lists, and navigations with CSS. Let's start styling. We'll first need to redefine our root folder for Chapter 7. So I'm going to go to my Files panel, and I'll choose Manage Sites, and I'm going to click Edit for my Chapter 6, or you can click on New, and I'm going to choose my Chapter 7, and now I need to actually browse for that particular folder, which is my new root folder. And there's my Chapter 7. If you're on a PC, you'll click once on it, say Select, and then say Select again, or right-click and then Select. So I'm on the Mac this time, so I will choose, and now Save. And now Done. So now I have my Chapter 7 available to me. Well, let's start out with a brand new CSS starter page so we have something to work with. So File and New. Once again, with this particular dialog box, you're able to do lots of different things. So I can start a brand new HTML page and see my layouts from here. I could also create a brand new HTML template from here, and we will talk about templates in another chapter. We can create a brand new library item, action script, CSS file from here, and also work with our back-end elements like Cold Fusion, PHP, or ASP.NET. If I take a look at blank templates, I can also do an HTML template from here, basically the same way I could with a blank page, but really just starting from a template to begin with. I can start out a page from a template. I don't have one already in any of my sites, so we won't be choosing that. I could do a page from a sample. So for instance, Arial is the very first one here, and it shows me some of the paragraph, table, H1 through H6 tags that have already been styled with Arial in CSS. Full design accessible, so it's written to use accessible measurements using EMS and some link effects and just regular text, etc. Now we don't use frame sets much anymore, but here are some elements from my frame sets, and it makes it fairly simple. And some other items that we might want to choose at some point in the future. We won't be getting into these in the Essentials series. So I'm going to go back to my blank page, make sure that I'm on HTML, and let's choose 2 columns fixed, right sidebar, header, and footer. Making sure that I know what doc type that I'm using, whether the layout CSS is going to add it to the head, it's going to create a brand new file, or link to an existing file. And we're just going to create a new file. Now we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I can enable in-context editing from here. In-context editing is something that we could also then use with Business Catalyst, which we will also talk about a little bit later on. But basically, it's a way for me to, without an actual CSS, kind of like a template, allow my client to be able to edit themselves. So I'm going to create, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in my Chapter 7 assets in my CSS file, and I will click Save. And before I start working with the page, I need to save this as well. So this is just an entitled page. So I can either use my keyboard shortcut, or I can do a Save As, and let's just save it as selectors. Because of my resolution, my page is a little bit larger, so I'm going to reduce that a little bit by Command and minus, which is Control plus minus in Windows, just so I can see my page a little bit better. So let's go ahead and fold this up a little bit and twirl down the arrow for my CSS rules so I can see what my rules are. So let's start with our body tag and taking a look at our sections here. I'm going to click on my edit rule, and I'm going to go to my type category, and I'm going to change this to 62.5 so that we have something a little bit more to work with. Notice that they've given a color and a line height here as well. You don't necessarily have to do a line height. It's just a general default for all of my items on my page. In this case, the majority of our items are going to be my paragraphs. And the same thing for the general color. Black's just a little boring, so I'm going to take that to just a darker gray. Notice that in my category for my box, I've got a padding of 0 in both my margin and the padding itself. And now I will go back to my type just one more time here, making sure that I have what I want in here. So I've got Verdana, Arial, Helvetica, and then any sans serif. That sounds good to me, and I'll click OK. So now that my page is incredibly tiny, I will go ahead and put that back to normal again with a Command plus or Control plus on the PC and scroll around so I can actually see what I'm doing here. We've got next a margin 0 for our unordered list, our ordered list, and our definition list. We also have a compound selector for all of my H tags and my P tags. What this is doing is giving me a margin top of 0 and a padding left and a padding right. So when I'm taking a look at my page here, I see that my text is not coming up and going flush with the actual container itself, because by default the container doesn't have any padding on it. My elements have padding on them instead. My margin top, let's talk about this again for just a second. We said that elements on my page have a default margin on them. So as a matter of fact, let's take a look. So if I click on my live view and then on my inspect button, my inspect button would like me to switch my workspaces so that I can see my code. And if I click on this, I don't have much room. You're more than welcome to. What it's going to do is it's going to give me a split view so that I can see both the code and the items on my page. Now this is incredibly useful, and this is a CS5 only feature. This was not in any other product of Adobe's before CS5. This one thing totally changes the game for me. I no longer have to open up a browser like Firefox that has extensions in it. I can really choose whatever the heck browser that I would like, and because I can do all of my debugging in here now, I don't have to do my debugging in the browser necessarily. Now we do have Browser Lab for that, and we will talk about that more later on. So as I roll my cursor over these elements, I see both my padding and my margin. So I see that I don't really have any margin above my header 1 tag here. I do have some padding to the left of it, and if I were to scroll over and try and find that again, there I see it on the right hand side as well. Underneath it, however, I do see my padding. So even though in that particular selector rule they didn't specify a margin bottom of anything, by default those elements already have a margin bottom. I also see that for my paragraphs, they were included as well in that particular rule, so they don't have a padding top and they have whatever their default was for the bottom. Using a compound selector like that is very, very handy at making global changes like that for all of my items. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention another type of CSS that is out there by Eric Meyer called reset.css. And all reset really does is items like this. It takes my HTML and all of my tags and it zeroes everything out. So that way I don't have to worry about what each browser does. I'm building in my own margins and paddings, etc. So it starts out with basically nothing and then I add my own from that point. So I'm going to take back off the inspect for a moment and my live view so I can actually see just my design view. Going back to my CSS styles and my all. Now let's make this look a little bit different. So this is our tag selector, and we're going to make a rule for this tag that's going to contain properties and values. So I've got my cursor sitting here. In my CSS panel, I have my H1 through H6 and P tag selected, because when I click on my new CSS rule down here, that's automatically then going to include this, and it's going to be underneath where I have selected. It always pops up as my compound selector, and if I choose tag, then it will just then include the H1 tag that goes along with that, which is what I want. So if I click OK now, let's give this different font. Because we have our sans serif for the rest of our fonts, I'm going to choose my Palatino, and we'll give it a different size, making sure that I give it a M instead of pixels, because that would be incredibly tiny. I'm going to change the color of it so that we can actually see we're making some choices. Let's say make it brown. And now I will click OK. So my font size has changed, the font family has changed, and now we can move on to our links. So I see right here in my very first paragraph that I have a link, so I can stay right here. Now I already have links set up here, but we're going to change this just a little bit. So I have an A link, a visited, a hover, a active, and focus. The link itself is saying that it's going to be underlined, and it has a color given. My visited also has an underline, and it's just a little bit lighter. I personally see no need for this. Depending on the design of your site, your end user may be a little confused as to whether they've been to that particular link or not. Now, with that color change just being very slight, they may or may not even notice that there is a color change on the page. So we're just going to add that in with the one above it. So I will select it here, and I will highlight it, and I will copy that. And I'm just copying the text, not the actual properties and values that go with that particular selector. I will click in a link, making sure my cursor is just right after it. I will do a comma, and then I will paste that in that same selector. Now I can delete this and get rid of that particular rule because I've just added it in with a link. So my link and my visited basically look somewhat the same normally anyway, and now they look exactly the same. My hover and my active and my focus really at the moment only have a text decoration of none. So I'm going to click on my edit rule, and we'll make this a little more obvious as to the fact that we have a color change when you roll your cursor over it. Personally, I think it should be obvious in some way. In this case, it is an underline when they are just looking at the page, and when they roll their cursor over it, the underline goes away. I personally like it the other way around, but whatever makes sense for your users, and if you do usability testing, then that will tell you which one you actually should use. And I click OK. I'm going to click on my live view so I can actually see what that looks like on my page. Great. So we changed our body to our 62.5, but I probably would have gone ahead and made a particular rule for strictly my paragraph. I want my text to be legible, and I also want enough white space around everywhere so that I am the one that's guiding where the users go on my page, not that there's so much text that they don't know where to look next. So using your white space is extremely important in our usability of our page. So we've got an area down here at the bottom that is part of our footer. So this is another example of where we can do a compound selector and have the paragraph in this particular section then look a little bit different than it does on the rest of the page. If this were truly a footer where I've got my copyright and maybe some other link information down here, I typically don't want that to be the exact same text as the rest of the page. This is basically complementary to the rest of the page. I want people to take a look at it, but it is not as important as the rest of the text on my page, so it's not going to be as large. So if I scroll down here to see where my footer is at, and then I'm going to click my cursor in my page again, always taking a look at the order in which these things are in my tags on my page themselves. I will click on my new CSS rule, and I don't need the container in there, and I'll just keep my footer and then the paragraph after it. Notice all there is just a space. This doesn't need a comma after it. It's not another selector type that's after it, so we don't need a comma. I will click OK, and let's make this fairly obvious. We'll make it a little bit smaller, and let's make it 0.8 ems. And we'll give it a different color, again, to make it really obvious. And how about red? And now when I click Apply, I see that only the text in that particular area, the paragraph in that particular area, has changed, and the rest of the page is the same. So now we can move on to looking at our navigations. When we talk about navigation in CSS, we really can be meaning anything from a horizontal navigation to a vertical navigation, etc. Now I still have this particular file open from our last lesson, and if I scroll up to the top, I see that I have an area over on the side for my link 1. So with my cursor over here in my file, I see that I have over on the side my CSS for that particular navigation. So I see that I have a ul.nav, ul.nav.li, ul.nav.a, ul.nav.a_visited, and then hover and active. So this is some really fairly simple CSS, doesn't require any JavaScript, etc. on my page. Even if I were to add some JavaScript to this, which would only give me some sort of effect, I want to make sure that the CSS works great first, and then I can think about what other types of effects that I would like to add to my page. So for instance, I'm going to click on Live View, and when I roll my cursor over these, I see that I have a rollover effect, that the whole entire area that I'm rolling my cursor over is changing so that I know that it is indeed selectable and a link. If we add something like this to our CSS, we want to make it as obvious as possible. I will uncheck my live view, and if I go back over to my code with my cursor in there, I see that I have a UL tag. It has a class style of nav to it. So like we talked about in our last lesson, we want to utilize how these are set up in our tags to begin with, and that's how we will then style them over in our styles panel for our CSS. So I have a UL, and it has a class style of nav. So then I have UL.nav because it's class style. If it were an ID, it would be UL#nav. I'll go back over to my design view. So that is given a list style of none, so that gets rid of my bullets. And if I were to get rid of that here and click back in my page, you will then actually see the bullets pop up. So I will type that back over here so I can actually see my bullets. It has a margin bottom to it, and in my LI it's given a border bottom, so my UL has the top part to that particular border, and my list items then have a bottom to them because they don't need the top, they just need the bottom, because the UL just has the top part to that. My ULA is what's actually styling the look and feel of those items. It's a block display, so that's what's making the actual block element around those particular links. I have my padding to make sure that nothing sits too close to the actual link itself. So when the user's cursor rolls over it, there is an area that we have as a hit state for that particular link. And I'm given my width in there as well. And my hover in active has a different background color and a different color to the actual image. Let's open up another file and get rid of that. Make sure I can see what I'm looking for over here, and in my files panel there is a links.html. If I actually click on my live view, I see that I've got a background image in these. And when I roll my cursor over each one of them, then my background image shows up instead of the image when I don't have my cursor rolled over it. And I actually have a drop down. So how did we make this? So let's take a look at our CSS panel and make sure I can see this. So let's take a look at the code first. So I'm going to take off my live view, and then I'm going to look at the code. So I see that I've got a div container wrapped around everything. Then I have a nav list UL. Now all these are IDs. They could certainly be class styles. It really doesn't matter. One way or the other, both will work. And I see that this is the end for my UL. Now we'll take a look at our code view a little bit later on, but if I click this little button right here, this little select parent tag, then I can see my element. Then I have my list item. Now if I go back to design view for just a second and click back on live view and I roll my cursor over my about, you'll see that I have a drop down menu. So again, I will uncheck that and go to my code view. So I've got my first part of that particular item, and if I take a look to the side here, you'll see that I don't have the end part of that tag. I do, however, have the end part of that tag right here. So inside of that then is wrapped another unordered list. So this is my sub-nav list. So this is the drop-down part. Now in my regular link, you'll notice that I also have an active and a current ID in here. This is so that I could add some more code and have that part of my tag look different than the rest of my links. So when the user is on a particular page, then they know by looking at the navigation as well as the page what page they're actually on. The same thing goes for my sub-nav. I also have a sub-active and a sub-current, which means that when they're on that second level page, that they would be able to tell what page that they're on from there as well. I finish off my LI tags here, and my UL, and then my LI, and then I just have my regular list items. So I go back over to my design view, and we'll click back over in live view for a second, and let's take a look. So I have a nav list and a nav container. My nav container has a height to it. If it doesn't have a height to it, then it looks like it isn't really a part of everything else. So for instance, if I were to get rid of this and I click on my inspect button, so now when I roll my cursor over particular elements, I see there's my nav container, and because of my color coding, it's hard to see my other elements. But I can see my padding in there. and the container itself. So I've got padding and margins in that one also. So I'm going to undo my inspect and just turn back on my live view again so I can actually see the effects that I'm looking at. I'm going to go ahead and click back on nav list. You'll notice that it doesn't have anything in here at the moment, but I could always add something here as well. If I wanted the whole entire container to be a color, for instance, I could choose to add that if I'd like inside of my UL tag there. So how do I want my link to look inside of here? I have my font weight normal. I have a decoration of none, making sure that I don't have an underline in there anywhere. And I have a text transformation of uppercase. Let's take a look at that really quick. And I'll see that if I were to change this to capital or something like that, and let's just click OK because I'm in live view, I won't be able to see it otherwise. And now I see, because I typed everything with just all lowercase, then I have the capability in CSS to make it look however I want it to look. So I will take that back to uppercase, and now that's uppercase again. So then I've got something that might freak you out just a little bit because we have commas in between these items. So basically what that's saying is my nav list itself, my UL with my nav list, because this is a list that has other items to it. So my first UL and then the second UL, and then the LI in there, I would like for them not to have a list style, and they have no margin or padding. My regular LI has just a float of left, so that is what allows all of my items to then float beside one another. There's another technique that we could use in that case, and that would be my block style of inline would move them to the side as well. My nav list LIA is where all of my images are coming from. So I have a background image and I have a background color. Now my background color is there just so that we can see it inside of our Dreamweaver page, and so that if something were to happen with the image, if the image were to be misplaced in another folder, or the worst case scenario happening, then at least it has a color behind it. I have a border color, I have a font color, and it has a little bit of a margin right to keep them from being pushed against one another, and it has a little bit of padding as well in it. Now the next I have my nav list hover and my active state. So this is what is giving the rollover effect, and so I've got a different image inside of my hover and active state. Now I've got my sublist, and it has a display of none, so that when you're just looking at your page like we are right now, in my live view, you're not actually seeing that. So if this were a display of any other kind, then you would actually be able to see that drop-down menu sitting there on the page. But because we have it as a display of none, we don't see it. In my sub-nav LI, in my sub-nav list LI, I have a float of none. So it's not trying to float to the side. We have to declare that there because we have a float left on our regular list item. So now I have a sublist of LIA, so the font inside of my sublist. Now it looked a little weird having it the exact same size as the rest of my font on that page, so I made it just a tiny bit smaller. It doesn't have a margin to it, but it has a little bit of padding to it so that I've got some room around the edges of that particular item. How do I want my hover and my sub-nav list to look? I want it to have a display of block. so that it looks basically the same as my other links. And it has a padding bottom and a top to it. It has a position of absolute. My positioning of absolute is so that I know exactly where that is going to fall when I roll my cursor over that. Now I've got my LI hover and my subnav list A, and it has a border and a block and a little bit of padding, and we need to actually give that a width. So when I roll my cursor over here, that is what's giving that width, that 10M. Then I have my hover subnav list AB4. Now that is just so that for my content, my property is just 2 colons in a row. So that's what's giving that little extra personality to that particular drop-down link. It doesn't have to be there for any reason whatsoever. I just thought it looked nice. So now we've actually seen 2 different types of navigation. We saw a vertical navigation and we've seen a horizontal navigation with a drop-down sub-nav, both done with strictly unordered lists. For our next lesson, we're going to take a look at positioning. So I'm going to fold this back up a little bit over here on my CSS styles and make sure that I can see my files panel. And let's take a look at dwenvironment.html. Now it looks probably a little bit different than when we saw it last in an earlier chapter. We've got pretty much every type of container that we could put on our page in this particular file. So for instance, I am going to go to my CSS styles panel here and fold up my files. And let's take a look at what we have. So from earlier, we took this file that had a few little elements in it, so a paragraph and a header and a subhead and a list item and some links. And we went to our page properties in our property inspector and we added our CSS properties from there. They ended up in between our head tags in our code view. And now I can see by looking at this in my styles panel, I don't even have to know that. If I take a look at a page and I've got these little brackets here that tell me that this is an actual style that's embedded in my page. So I can go to my code and confirm that yes indeed that is all embedded in my page. So I've got all the elements that we had styled before and we added a few more little containers. So I've got container 1 and that is just my regular container. It has a margin left auto and a margin right auto and a little bit of padding. If I were to click on my page here, I see that I've got, a wrapper around the majority of my elements on my page, and in that wrapper I just have a background color and a little bit of padding and a width of a percentage. So for my container 1 that I see here on my page, if I click on it in my tag selector, I see that I have some padding and I have a margin along with this. I've given it an margin left auto and a margin right auto just so that I could center that inside of my other container. It still has some of the other things that we styled earlier. Inside of that, I've got another container. Now this is my container 4, and if I take a look at my property inspector, I see that it doesn't have an ID name. It doesn't have any overflow. I know just by looking at these containers that it's not an absolutely positioned item because I would have to have my left and my top in here as well. And so when I click on it over here, I see that it is a relative position. So I can give that a left or a right or exactly where I would like that to be positioned then relative to the parent container. If I scroll down a little bit, I'll notice that I have another container down here. So this is my container 3, and if I click inside of it, I see that I have a background color, of course, and a positioning of fixed. Now, looking at it right here in the file, this doesn't look all that exciting until I actually go to my live view. Now I see it's really over top of everything else. And if I scroll on my page, then I also notice that it is basically then locked to the bottom of my page, and everything else then will scroll underneath it because it's fixed on my page, so it's going to stay put. And I've given it a position of 0 for the bottom. Click back on here again. And so that will always then be stuck to the bottom of my page. Now if I scroll up a little bit here, you'll see 2 other containers, and I'm going to turn back off my live view again so we can take a better look at these. Now this should be a little bit interesting. So this should look to you very different than the rest of my containers, and if I click on it, you're noticing me grabbing that and moving that around. That is my container 2. Now I've moved this, so that's changing over here as well. So I see that my left 229, and if I grab this and I move that here, then that's going to be my left of 68 because it is absolutely positioned on my page. It's using a mapping to my upper left-hand corner of my browser, so it is going to be absolutely where I put it on the page. I have another absolutely positioned item here, and you'll notice that these things have a stacking order to them, and I have visibility to these as well, so they can overlap, etc. And if I click over here on my AP elements, that I see that that one has a name, but this one does not. So that one is just my container 2, and that's just simply something that I drew on my page. If you take a look at your insert panel, and I will pull this down a little bit, we have common, layout, forms, data, spry, in context editing, text, and favorites. I'm in my layout part of my panel. I have 2 little pieces to this. I've got a standard view, the way we're working now, and an expanded view that allows me, when I'm working with tables, to be able to separate the table a little bit so that I can click in between my cells inside of a table. I can insert a div tag from here, the same thing as my insert layout objects and div tag. I can draw an AP div, so that's my absolutely positioned div, and if I just select that and I click inside of my page and I can draw, and then when I select it, I'm just going to simply give it a background color. You can choose any color you like. So I see that, as I fold this back up again for a moment, I see that my new div is named app div 2. That's fine. I also notice that my container 2 is still unnamed, so let me fix that now. So in my property inspector, I will say that is my original. So now I actually see that over in my AP elements. So for instance, this is a lot like Photoshop. So if you're familiar with Photoshop and you're used to moving items around, I see that I've got a stacking order. And if I grab that and I give it a different Z index, we'll give it 5. Now that goes up to the top of my page, and it is now above all of my other items. I also have a visibility. So if I click over here by my eyeball, I can turn the visibility on or off. I'll turn that back on. I go back over to my CSS styles, and with that particular container, so that is my absolute. Now I've given it an overflow of auto. So basically what that means is if I take a look at my page here and I go to my code, I see I actually have a fair amount of text in here. But because I have given that an overflow of auto, not until I go to my live view, and now I've got some scroll bars, and I could now scroll to see the rest of my content. Not necessarily very attractive, is it? But you see this fairly often in web design, more often than not from a Flash developer rather than a CSS page. But if you have to, you can do it. So let's actually take a look at my panel here, and I'll click on my edit, and let's just go to positioning. So again, I've got absolute, fixed, relative, and static. Now, static I don't need to choose unless I'm making sure that it is static. Static is just the default. So the div that is wrapping around my entire page is indeed just a static without actually choosing static. It's a static container. So my absolute gives me my absolute values. My fixed will fix it to a particular part of my page. Relative is relative to my parent container. Relative is great to use for things like logos inside of a container or some item that you then want to position precisely inside of the parent container. Now there's one other thing that we need to talk about when we're talking about positioning, and that is our float. Now we talked about floats a little bit. Let me just get rid of some of this content. Don't need some of these containers any longer. So I do have an item here that was my container 1. Let's go ahead and change this just a little bit so we can see what that would look like with a float. So I'm going to go ahead and edit that rule. I'm going to go to my box container, and let's get rid of my auto on this. Now let's give this an actual value. Let's say 300 pixels. And maybe just 5 on the padding. And if I just click apply, now that is over in line with the other items on my page. If we take that and we tell it to float left and I click apply, you'll see that it doesn't necessarily move on my page because it's not above any of the other items on my page, but the container itself no longer basically sees that whole entire float because we don't have a clear underneath that at all. So let's go ahead and say OK to that so we can see it overlapping that other container. If I go to my code, and I'm just going to make sure that I don't have a clear in here, so we'll just basically make something simple here. So right after that particular div, I will type a BR and let it just say clear and all. And I will finish that out, and it goes ahead and puts the / in there for me. I will refresh and go to my design, and now that is wrapped back around the rest of my items on my page. Whenever I have that float, I have to clear it at some point so that the other things that are on the page will look like I expect them to look, and the container will wrap around all of the items. So now we've just had a beginning look into the different types of positioning in CSS. Now let's take a look at how we can work with our code just a little bit better in working with CSS. So I'm going to have you go back to your selector.html, and again, if we don't have that open, we did save that, so I'm just going to click on don't save my file here. and I'm going to go to my file and open, or I can use my files panel, and I'm going to open back up, because we did save it at one point, my selectors.html. So it's just back to its default at this point, which is just fine. So when I'm working with my CSS, there's times when I would like to add items or change items. And with changing things and making sure that things are laid out the way that I would like, there are several different ways that I can do that. My first way that we really haven't looked at all that much so far is working with my property inspector. So if I put my cursor in a particular element on my page and I click on my CSS properties, I see that it is my targeted rule at the moment for that H1, H2, etc. If I click on this, I see my cascade. So I see that I've got my body, container, content, and then this. Now, this doesn't really tell me a whole lot. If I would like to make a new CSS rule, I can do so in here. A new inline style, I can also do that at this point. And my inline style would be around that particular item. And I'm not going to create that just now. We're going to do that when we take a look at the code and make sure that you know how to do an inline style. If I click back on that, I also see that I could apply a class style from here as well, or remove a class style. And I get just a list of all the class styles that I have available. If I just highlight a little bit of text here, and again I'm just going to highlight this once, and I can say my new CSS rule, or I could again apply one of my rules from here. Now, only when I'm in my HTML properties and I take a look at my class styles do I get a better actual view of what that might entail. So I get a tiny little bit of preview, whatever it can give me a preview of what that class style might actually look like. So heaven forbid, I should say header, and now that is highlighted just like the header style up here. Because it's a class style, I can apply that anywhere inside of my page. And I'll just say none. And I will click over here again. And if I were to take a look at my current in my CSS styles panel, I see a summary for that particular selection. So it is taking on my body rules. It's also taking on the color from my body. It is showing me that it's a margin of 0 and a padding right and left of 15. So if I roll my cursor over here to the left, I can disable that particular bit of my property. So it doesn't matter if I do it on right. Here I'll do it on left, and I'll just click that. And all of my padding for my H1 through H6 and my P tags is now gone for my padding left. Now if I take a look at my links over here on the right hand side of my page, I notice that my cascade goes from hover and my visited and my a hover, a active, and a focus. And by the way, my focus is so that somebody navigating by keyboard will have the same hover experience as somebody who's actually clicking on my page. So I can decide up here what I maybe want to get rid of, and if I get rid of my background color, then you see it looks like it does in the rest of my sidebar. It's gotten rid of that nice green color over there. So now I'll come back over to my file. And once again, I want to make sure that you're aware of what happens when you don't have your default font declared in your CSS. So far, everything that we've looked at and everything that we've done, we've actually had a default font. But what if we didn't have one? So then we'd be at the mercy of the browser. The browser would then, in its preferences, say what the default font was for our page. Really the default everything for our page if we didn't have something already selected. The end user, whoever's looking at our website, could also have their own style sheet, and then that would take precedence over the basic defaults that the browser has. So we need to be aware of those things when we're making our style sheets, and take into consideration that if we don't cover all of our bases, then the browser might do it for us. So as my cursor is sitting here, I'm noticing my code navigator. So once again, my code navigator I could either click on at the moment, and that would bring up that code navigator. If I'm on my PC, I could hold down my Alt key, and on the Mac I could hold down my Command and Option key, and when I click, I bring up my code navigator, and when I roll my cursor over each individual item, it tells me the properties and values for that particular rule. Notice that I have my padding left on here still, and if I were to click on this here now, that would take me to that in the code itself, which is really handy because there's sometimes when you have a very long style sheet and you're not quite sure where that item is and you want to see it in the code, not necessarily in your CSS styles. Maybe you want to move some things around. Using your code navigator is really handy. Let me go back to my design view. So I'm going to click back on and enable that particular property. There we go. So I have my padding left back in my page. And if I highlight this, let's say that this is part of a quote. So in my property inspector, in the same little grouping of buttons as my unordered list and ordered list, I also have my block quote. And if I click on that, I now have an extra indent for that particular block of code. And now I can style this however I want in CSS. So if I want nice big quote marks in my page, or if I want this surrounded by a rounded rectangle, etc., it's actually up to me now. And once again, just making sure that we know that we can click on Inspect. It's going to also turn on my live view, and when I roll my cursor over these items, I can see the padding and margins for that particular element on my page. So hopefully now you're more familiar with working with your CSS.